Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Charisma Jean-Marie, and I serve as the Director for Racial Justice Ministries at Scarritt Bennett Center. And we are grateful for another opportunity to come live and bring you conversations that's related to racial justice work. This week's conversation is entitled Racism, a Multicultural Conversation. And that's exactly what it is. It's a multicultural conversation that you're invited to be witnesses of. Last week, this is part two. Last week, we started with part one, and part one was really our panelists just sharing their own personal stories about who they are and where they come from. And I invite you, if you have not tuned in, I invite you to check out our archives on our Facebook Live videos. And please go and bear witness to the amazing stories we heard last week. And we're inviting you to be part of those conversations, to listen so that you might hear and be transformed. That's the work, I believe. We approach this work. I approach this work because I believe in the power of transformation. And I believe storytelling is an amazing tool that helps us to debunk stereotypes, that helps us to begin to do the work, the necessary work of internalizing our own experiences of what it means to be a co-conspirator that is active and dismantling white supremacy. And so storytelling is one of the tools we use here at Scarritt Bennett Center, and we invite you. Last week was an amazing opportunity to hear the stories of our panelists. All of our panelists, I'm grateful, are all back this week. And this week we dive deeper. We go and have a conversation about racism in their own communities and culture, but the ways and also the ways in which we internalize racism. At Scarritt Bennett Center, we see racism as water that we all drink, water that we all live in, water that we breathe. We're all affected one way or another by racism. And so we want to have these honest conversations. And so I welcome you to, again, this amazing conversation this afternoon as our great panelists come and share their experiences, their stories around racism in their culture and also communities. As always, you are always welcome to be part of the conversation by adding your comments and questions in the comment section there on our Facebook Live post. And this is sacred space, and here at Scarritt Bennett Center, sacred space also means difference is appreciated and welcome. But difference does not mean hate or disrespect, and so any comments that might reflect any type of disrespect or hate of our panel, or even these conversations we're having, will be deleted immediately. And so we invite you to be part of this great conversation this afternoon, but we invite you to do it in a way that helps you to do the hard work of reflecting in the ways in which you perpetuate and participate in racism, but also in the ways in which you can help dismantle white supremacy, first with you and in your own homes and with family and community and out in the world. Oftentimes we try to do this work and we go out in the world and we don't look internally. We invite you to first do the work internally with yourself, then your family and friends, and out in the world. Again, thank you for joining us. I welcome all of our panelists, and our moderator, Jilla Prevalon, is here to moderate this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for setting this afternoon up for us, Reverend Charisma. This conversation has been one conversation that has caused me to pause throughout the week. After last week's session and hearing from my brothers and sisters on the panel and hearing their stories, what I shared last week was seen to be true, that there is a danger in having just one story. Last week, what it did was that it revealed the layers that we all have, especially for those of us here on the panel. Last week, I also shared a little bit of my context. I was born in Haiti, grew up in New Jersey, and currently living in Texas. And last week, I shared that Haiti, my native land, is the only country that had this the only successful slave revolt. Oftentimes when I share that fact, we put a period behind it and we don't hear the other parts of the story. For our first question today, which is, how has racism impacted our native land, where the panelists will share a little bit of what racism has looked like in their native land and what racism has looked like in this Eurocentric vision of America as well. So after the period, after Haiti, to answer that question, after Haiti has been the only country, the only Black republic to successfully have a slave revolt, there is a ... And the ... was that racism happened, continued to happen. France charged Haiti a huge fee for its freedom, $21 billion to date, approximately $21 billion. And all the nations around Haiti and around the world would not recognize Haiti as a free nation. They would not do trade with Haiti. They would not do business with Haiti. They basically squelched the economy of Haiti. And so today, many people will look at Haiti and say, they love using the word Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. But we need to learn about what happened that brought Haiti to where it is today. And what happened is that racism happened, white supremacy happened, whiteness happened, and whiteness would not allow Haiti to be a free nation without a fight. And the fight was $21 billion. And then, last week we talked a little bit about that. And so racism continues to happen even today, as you look at, the sheer missionaries who go to Haiti and they don't know the language, the culture. They don't care. Many of which that I've met don't care to know the language and culture, but because many of them are white, they feel like they have a right. They have a right to be in Haiti, to evangelize, to do the work of God. That's how we phrase it, but it's colonization in a different way. And and racism continues to happen. We see it as how the 1% in Haiti, which oftentimes look different from the 99% of Haiti, is owning Haiti. They own Haiti. So racism looks very interestingly in Haiti. Many times we will think that Haiti has a Black president, it has Black people that live in it. How could there still be racism in Haiti? Well, the answer I would say is follow the money, follow where the money is coming from, or lack thereof. Then we will talk about racism and what racism looks like. And so I want to open it up to the panel as we have this conversation with one another. What has racism looked like in your native land, and what does it look like for you today? So you can just jump in because we're just talking to one another today.
Well, I don't mind jumping in, going ahead and getting us started. Thank you, Scarritt, Bennett, again, for inviting me. And it's great to be on this panel with everyone. My name is Rosa Ponce. And last week, one of the things that I shared was that I'm from Arizona, the southwest corner where Arizona, California, and Mexico meet and are separated by the Colorado River. And so, I don't know, when I saw this question, I was like, what does that mean? I don't even understand it. And just kind of as I've sat with it the last few days, I think the very obvious one that I want to, share here with everyone is the wall. Everyone hears about this wall that our government, is funding, putting billions and billions of dollars behind it. And I just think about, I've been gone from my hometown over 20 years now, but I go back every year. And I was just thinking about it. Like, I feel like I've gone back once or twice a year, and I'm like, I think of those, I don't know what they're called, but where you have like that 1 second of a picture, and then, you know, for like 20 seconds. And that's kind of how I like think back of my hometown, right? Leaving, seeing, we're an agricultural town, so it's like fields of different things, produce all the time. And then where I live, you can see Mexico. And so just seeing that, right? And then like every year how that has changed. And I just remember the first time that I saw like them beginning to set up maybe like the steel for the walls. I was just really offended, you know. It's like, what are they doing? I mean, right through like the agricultural fields. And then now, I mean, there is a wall, and it just feels so ridiculous as somebody who grew up going back and forth. And the same way that, you know, us living in Arizona would cross over to sometimes get medicine or cheese or whatever, you know, people from Mexico would cross over, and back then it was Kmart, go and get whatever they needed. And, you know, everyone just kind of lived and worked together. In the morning, you see workers crossing the border to come work in the fields, the agricultural fields. And yeah, and that's the other, to me, it was those two things, the wall and the agriculture, because a majority of the produce in the wintertime comes from my area. And so just thinking about the labor behind it, my grandparents worked in agriculture, and I remember like it was dark when they left and it was dark when they came back, and it didn't matter the season, they were covered up with the bandanas and long sleeves to protect them, you know, from the elements. So yeah, those are the two things that I think were very obvious. And not to go much longer, but then I think some of the impact that this has on your behavior, right? You just kind of begin to, I mean, Arizona has had a lot of racist laws in the last 10 years, and like how that behavior makes you adjust, how those laws make you adjust your behavior. So those are just some of the, you know, how don't go through that road because there's probably a checkpoint there, or just things like that. Check in when you leave, check in when you get there, because you just never know with all the border patrols that are constantly in our area. So yeah, those are the things that I definitely wanted to mention today.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else can jump in.
I think for me, it's a difficult question to answer, and I didn't notice it at first. I didn't know what that meant as a child experiencing it. And so having to go back and revisit India often, being able to visit family members, being able to be in the environment that I grew up in, and being able to see uncles and aunts and things like that, it became very evident. And one of the first things that I started noticing is, as a photographer, I love seeing other photographers work. And so in India, there's quite a few billboards of advertisement, and it's usually the elegant Indian dresses, the attires that they're selling, the clothing stores have it. And one of the common things that I saw over and over again is, why is all the models white? And it doesn't represent the local community. It didn't represent the people that are there. And if you look at a majority of the billboards, especially from where I came from, it becomes obvious that these people are European descent or some type of influence there. And it's not even Indians. You very rarely see Indians on those billboards. And so I began to dig into it a bit more, and I really wanted to change that perspective. How do you begin to say there is beauty in the community that we're from, and regardless of skin color? And so starting to go back, dig a little bit further into my childhood, that's when I have heard, and this isn't personally has happened to me, but I know that Indian parents want lighter, the lighter the child, the better it is. And so they try to find candidates that are lighter. And so if you look at any Indian matrimonial, it will say fair and lovely. I mean, it's publicly advertised where colorism comes into play, and within that community, and it becomes more and more evident. We do certain things. We feed, we put certain type of spices in to make us lighter. These are all things that culturally that ingrained in us to be able to say, hey, lighter is better. And so you look at movies, for example, you look at movies, there are very few movie stars that are darker. And so just begin to kind of search, where does this come from? And so India is a colonization, it's British influenced for a long time. And so this is where all this came from, is somehow lighter is better. There is a superiority because you're lighter skinned. And I think that those are things that I have started to notice more and more. And being able to personally experience that there, and being able to understand that. And only way for me to understand that is having to go back and see that in my own culture. I know personal people, friends, their grandparents pray for the child to be lighter. And I mean, it's just ingrained in our community, and that's a sad reality of it. It's a painful truth, and the truth is that, you know, we don't talk about this. It's just become part of the culture, and you just do them. And so going from that to being able to say, how do you change my perspective? You know, I have these biases. And how do I change my own world first, and then being able to understand it? I think it's both. You know, in the film industry, it is Bollywood. India has the most vast movie productions. Every state has its own film industry. And you look across all film industries, you look at actresses and actors. If you look at the population of white, lighter complected movie stars compared to darker, it becomes very evident that is lighter is better. And so changing my perspective is, and how do I evolve from this? How do I understand this? And then there is the cultural element of it is the caste system alone, and attributed to that also. So there are so many layers of how we look at race, and this is race just within our own people group. Mm-hmm. How we manage our own people group, and so first thing is, I think, Jula, I really loved what you said, is just being able to say, how do we take care of ourselves? How do we go from here? And so self-reflecting and being able to learn through those, and then being able to understand the world a little bit better, and then say, what can I do to change that? How do I become part of something? And the only way to become part of something is being honest about our own culture.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's funny that, not funny, but it's interesting that you talk about symbols. Both you and Rosa both shared about symbols. Rosa shared about the symbol of the wall. You know, it means something. And then for you, the billboards, that means something, and what's on the billboard. And for us, it's the fort. There's a fort that the Haitian government built in the north of Haiti right after they won independence in 1803. They built this fort because France accosted Haiti so much. They said that they would come back and fight Haiti for the land again, because Haiti was very profitable. And so France, someone in the audience asked, when did the slave revolt occur? And I think there was a follow-up question as well. And so it was around that time, 1788, 89, and it lasted 13 years where the people were trying to fight for independence. But they had to build this fort. This fort is a symbol of racism, you know, that because how dare a land of Black people, you know, gain their independence? And so the Haitian people built this fort. They never used it. You know, you can still go to Haiti and see this fort. It's on this high mountain where they can see the ocean and they can see the French army coming in. They never used it, but there's still real cannons and real, you know, it's a symbol. And I think these symbols will continue. These symbols are the things that remind us that there is more than just a binary Black and white when it comes to racism, that there are these things in our native lands as well, even if we forget it, because sometimes because our countries are predominantly Indian or Haitian or Mexican, we can sometimes think that there's no such thing as racism in our land. You know, nothing's still happening. That was then, and this is now. All that is done with. But what Rosa, you, Niji, and myself are saying is that it's still pretty evident in our land till today. So I would like to hear some more from the other panelists about what does racism look like in your land today? And then we'll circle back around to talk about how have you experienced racism here in America? So let's circle through the panel, through the panelists on this first question. Who else would like to jump in? Go ahead, Jose.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chime in. I think Puerto Rico is a very interesting story, both in terms of its national history, but also of its race and racist origins. We've been under two colonial powers. We were under Spanish rule, which had a very different way of dealing with the races, as they call them. And then in the Spanish-American War, we became property of the United States, another country that had its own kind of racist past, with its own racist policies. And so we've inherited two racist traditions, which have now melded in some way. And as we probably know, the English policy was no mixing, right? You were trying to avoid mixture. Whereas Spain and Portugal as well were more open to mixing, but of course, you would quote unquote pay for that mixing. They didn't stop it, but they had, Brother Niji talked about the caste system. We had casta paintings. There was this sort of caste that went from white from Spain to white born here, down onto African at the very bottom. And these mixtures, and it's a pseudoscientific way of categorizing people based on who their mother was and their father was. And if you were a native and Black, you went under this category. And if you were a Criollo, which was Spanish, but Spanish born in the so-called Americas, you had a different kind of understanding. So we inherited that tradition. And so we had a lot of mixing in our culture early on that then obviously continued into US rule, US domination. In popular culture, Puerto Rico is, I would say there's a sort of twin tension. There's this tension between this very spoken of pride about our Spanish, so-called Indian or Taino and African roots. And I don't think there's a fakeness to that. There's a real sort of, we are African, and we are Taino, and we are Spanish. And there's this sort of celebratory tone to when we talk about that. My wife went to a school in Puerto Rico, and they learned that, and they didn't learn it as a, oh man, this is horrible. They learned it as a way of celebration. And when we look at our music and our food and everything else, we recognize that our food wouldn't be as good and our music wouldn't be as good without that sort of mixing that happened. And so in one sense, this is wonderful celebration of African culture, of Indian culture, or Taino culture. And then there's, at the same time, there's this language that has codified racist tendencies, also colorist tendencies in terms of, so we say things like, to marry lighter para mejorar la raza, to better the race, or curly hair gets called bad hair. The term is bad hair. And at the same time, there's this tension. The moment you try to act too much like, act too white, there's this expression, I think I shared it last week, and your grandma, where's she, right? So everybody has African grandma, if you will. That's the sort of mythos that we live on. So I think Puerto Rico has this really weird tension with its Black past, particularly, in that there's these comments of celebratory appreciation, and yet encoded in the very language, bad hair, better the race. You have this unfortunate repercussion to colorism. I think what the US, aligning with the US, not our choice, but being aligned to, it's probably better phrasing, being aligned to the US, and particularly in the way social media, internet, TV first, obviously, accelerates cultural influence. I think now we've become, unfortunately, to adopt some of the US racist patterns and behaviors that, again, has had twin effects, has had this sense in which parts of white culture get praised and elevated, parts of Black culture as well get praised. Hip hop, and for example, is very common and very popular in Puerto Rico. But because of we had this both kind of celebratory, here are African roots, here are Taino roots, here are Spanish roots, and at the same time we had this encoded kind of caste and colorist language. I think that we're actually still trying to figure that out. And I think that part of that is we're now seeing, for example, last few trips, there used to be this pattern of straightening your hair. They used to say, pasarte el blower, the hair dry, and straighten your hair. Now you're starting to see, particularly women, but not just women, kind of grow it natural and say, this is who we are. You're starting to see rappers and reggaetoneros kind of elevating the sort of African heritage of who we are, and saying, not just celebrating it, but also denouncing the ways that's been suppressed, ridiculed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Puerto Rico's still figuring out. And again, I say that as somebody who was only born in Puerto Rico and interacts with Puerto Rico as, in some ways, an outsider, in some ways, somebody who grew up in Chicago, one of the most segregated cities in the United States. We talk about how multicultural it is. Yes, but you give me a map of Chicago and I'll draw you all the lines where the Mexicans start and the Chinese start and where they end and where the Ethiopians are, where the African Americans are. We can draw with almost to the street just how racially divided we are. And so I think that we're living into that. So again, I'm reading that sort of Puerto Rican experience from somebody who shouldn't be throwing the first stone. That even though there is in some places this wonderful cross-cultural engagement in Chicago, there's also this long history of deep segregation in the city. So for me, I think that's some of the pieces that I would lift up in terms of the experience of the island and where it is and where I think it should go.
That's great. Thank you for sharing, Jose. It's interesting you talked about the Taino people. I remembered when I first learned that Puerto Rico and Haiti had the same native people on their lands. I'm like, oh, so that means we're cousins.
Right.
So there is
right.
that we do share the same native people. The Haiti and Puerto Rico share the same native people. So Thank you for sharing about the roots to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Tasha,
Yeah.
Gerald. Okay, Tasha's going up.
So to follow up with what Jose was sharing, Panama has similar history as far as having colonial influences from two distinct places. I will start by saying, of course, I don't have a lot of personal experience in this because I left Panama when I was 10 years old. But even at 10 years old, I had experiences. I remember being the only brown girl in my classes, which seems in my mind like, is that possible? But I do remember not having other brown people that I connected with in class. And I remember being very much othered by a group of white girls in the class. They liked to pick on me a lot. And I don't think, I know that at the time, of course, I wasn't processing that with the sense of awareness of racism or whatever, but it was something that I was aware of. I can't really say that it was traumatizing, but it also, I am clear that it was something that I was not surprised by. So obviously I had some level of awareness that there was a divide here, and that divide was part of the natural order of things, right? So just to understand how, or answer the question in short, how does racism manifest in Panama? The same way it manifests here in the United States is really not any different. And to do that, you gotta understand the history of Panama. So again, it was colonized by the Spaniards. So there was an original indigenous population that of course was abused and oppressed. Blacks, enslaved African people were introduced into Panama as initially to work the ships on the ports, and then that were carrying, the plunder of the Spaniards across the isthmus. And then when they had decimated the indigenous population that they were using to physically carry the plunder across the isthmus, then they began to bring enslaved people to replace the indigenous population labor. And then, so if you think about it in that context, you have this population that was introduced as oppressed people. They were oppressed from the racism was there from the inception of their introduction into the land. And the people who were there originally were oppressed by the colonial powers. And then, so the one thing about Panama is that Panama only has been in existence as an independent country for a little over 100 years. Our independence dates back to 1904, because prior to that, we were part of Gran Colombia, which was Venezuela, Colombia, I think it was Ecuador and Panama had gotten together and formed this one nation. And our independence in 1904 was backed by, guess who? The United States, in order to secure the rights to build the Panama Canal. And so they backed our independence from Gran Colombia in order to secure this strip of land, autonomous territory that belonged to the United States. Originally, the treaty was in perpetuity, forever. The United States will have it. And one of the reasons why they got it that way and they backed the independence, because the government of Gran Colombia was not favorable to those terms. They wanted sovereignty over the land managed by the United States, and it would revert back to Gran Colombia after a certain amount of years, I think 99 years. And Colombia was like, it's these terms or nothing. And so what the United States figured out at the time was, we'll just back the rebels and have Panama secede from Gran Colombia and we'll get what we want. And that's how the Panama Canal came to be, but also the Panama Canal zone. So this strip of land that the United States had control over, and they imported their segregation and their racism and their Jim Crow. So even from the beginning in the 1800s, I think that, well, the US began building in 1904. So, and the majority of the labor was from the Caribbean islands. We talked about that in the last session. They were paid less than the white American labor. And so there was the silver roll and the gold roll. The silver roll was for the Black West Indian population, and the gold roll was for the white American population. The Blacks were housed in decrepit barracks that had been built before under the French that had been falling. So it's been there. There was segregation on the canal zone. There were separate quarters. There were separate entrances. Jim Crow was in full effect there. There's some telling that in the 1950s, when there was civil rights unrest here in the United States, and in order to prevent that type of unrest on the canal zone, Black people were expelled out of the canal zone. So they just imported the racism right along. And so there's that brand of discrimination and racism that happened within of US discrimination. And then outside of that, there is now the Panamanian population. The native Panamanian population is mostly mestizo. So it's a mix of Spaniards and indigenous people, and then you have this Black population that's different. They speak English, and there's an anti kind of Americanism and an anti-English kind of sentiment among the native population. So then there's this second level of discrimination that the Black population gets from the mestizo population in the country. So it's no different. To this day, the Black population in Panama is mostly relegated to certain areas, impoverished areas, underrepresented in positions of power and in industry. There's a lot of colorism. If you're fairer, you have a better chance of getting work. If you're dark skinned, Panama is very banking, commerce, and tourism centered economy. And so the fairer you are, the better chance you have of getting a good position. The darker you are, the harder it is for you. So it basically, there's not a lot of difference. It's the same thing, different country.
Wow, thank you so much, Tasha, for sharing yet another symbol, the canal. I never thought that the canal was a symbol of racism in and of itself. How they would use that, to further expand racism. For those of you who are just joining us in this conversation, we're expanding the conversation beyond the binaries of Black and white when it comes to racism. And we're peeling back the layers so you can see what racism looked like in our native land as well. Just because it's all Puerto Rican or all Haitians or whatnot, there's still the influence of white supremacy in our land. And so we wanted to expand the conversation. If you're just tuning in, please send us your questions. This is a conversation we're having with each other. I'm taking notes. I'm learning so much from my brothers and sisters on this panel, just about what their context look like. Because sometimes we may see someone and not really understand their context. And this conversation allows us to understand a little bit more. So thank you for my brothers and sisters on the panel. And for those of you watching, leave us your questions and your comments. All right, we have one last person on the panel to share a little bit about racism. Gerald, tell us a little bit about your land. What does racism look like in your context?
Thanks, Gila, and thanks again to the Scarritt Bennett Center for hosting this conversation. It's a kind of extremely multidimensional and complicated question when I think about it for myself personally. I consider my native land Mississippi. I was born in Jackson. That's the place where I lived the longest, 17 years of my life.
That's right.
I haven't been back in a quarter of a century almost, but it deeply shaped me. And I think in order to think about how racism manifests in my native land, I kind of want to approach it in three ways. One, talking about myself, who doesn't like to talk about themselves. Two, thinking about Mississippi. And then three, Taiwan. which is more of kind of an Ur land where my parents are from. But for myself, I mean, racism was cognizant to me as soon as I could understand the English language. And it was like being a part of a conflict between two races, primarily black and white, that had nothing to do with me. And then also that became directed at me. So Mississippi, as you may know, for all of its strengths, and I love it, has one of the lowest median incomes in the country. Highest teenage pregnancy rates, used to have one of the highest murder per capita rates. All of these kind of social problems, one of the least educated, illiteracy is still a plague there. We just took the stars and bars, you know, the Confederate flag off of our state flag this year. And I thought that would never happen in my lifetime, but every social problem we have there is rooted in racism. And in particular, a long history of black and white racism, but you know, it gets pointed to folks like me, even though I was less than 1% of the population when I was growing up there. I mean, from both blacks and whites being called chink or choyoyoy, or asking if I knew karate or where I was from. And I would frame a lot of it, I think, in terms of trying to prove my masculinity, now that I think about it. In East Asian culture, there are varying degrees of hirsuteness in the male population. And for my own particular heritage, we're not very hairy. You know, like I couldn't grow a full beard or something like this. And I just remember sort of lightly being made fun of for as long as I can, you know, like, why don't you, like, do you even shave? How often is it? Or, you know, how come there's not much hair under your arms? And this is significant, I think, not only for me, but for wider American culture, because unfortunately, part of the way that we accept human difference, and especially for males in the country, is to sexualize them. And I would make the assertion that Asian American males in particular are the most emasculated subpopulation in this country, both on a popular level and sort of culturally. And I certainly think this was something that I wrestled with while I was growing up. You know, I had in different ways, because it's ironic, during the gold rush, there was kind of a yellow peril, a fear that these Asian men would taint mostly the white race through producing different progeny. But that's evolved into just sort of stripping away what we would consider typical masculinity. You know, I had fathers of daughters refusing them to date me and this kind of thing. But so how did I know it? I just knew it in the derogatory statements directed toward me, this kind of mold of what it meant to be a man and not quite fitting within it. And then also within my own education, you know, I went to 7 different school buildings from really 8, from first to my first grade to my senior year in high school. One was because I started school early. My parents wanted me out of the house, so I went to a Southern Baptist private school that met in a church gymnasium. But after that, I was in the public school system of Clinton, Mississippi, my entire education, a different school building for 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th and 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th, 9th, 10th and 12th. Well, why did this happen? This is a legacy of desegregation. We had all these buildings left over. So what do you do with them? Well, you just move classes around. And this was never discussed at all. You know, I didn't even think about this until I was a graduate student, really. But this is how deep I think racial transgression is in my particular home state, and what it does in terms of poisoning the culture. The nicest people you'll meet in Mississippi are there, you know, and I had friends both, like I was skateboarding with Jamario or whatever, and playing the trumpet with Kenyatta and Melvin, and then growing up with John David and Ben. So I had friends like on both sides, but in terms of anti-Black racism, I mean, I heard the N-word just immediately, like as soon as I could understand the English language and it was kind of acceptable parlance, discreetly said if you were trusted or something like this. And even within my own family, I think even though my dad taught at an HBCU, the last thing my parents would want me to do is bring home, a Black girlfriend or something like this. Even a white one, really. They just wanted someone Chinese. But so this is deeply problematic. And, how this all fits, I think, when I think about it in my native land, well, Mississippi is often targeted as being the most racist state in the country. And I think this is an unfair classification. I started my teaching in theological education at a school in Boston, and that's the most racist city I've ever lived in, I think. And it's way north of the Mason-Dixon line. I went to college at St. Louis, did my master's in Atlanta, my PhD in Vanderbilt. I've traveled to over 45 countries, lived in over 6 major cities, worked in England, Germany, and the US. In every place, racism is a scourge. And it's amazing how it happens, because even though I began by saying, I entered this kind of black and white conflict, it's internal, right? There's sort of intra-racial, there's interracial violence and bias and bigotry, and we've already spoken about it in terms of colorism. But even within Asian American culture, there's a hierarchy, right? It's usually like the Chinese or the Japanese on top, then maybe the Koreans, and then the Southeast Asians are like way down there. So it's amazing how all this kind of what are political constructs, racism is something that's invented, have very real, just multi-fanged expressions everywhere you go geographically, and anywhere that I've been. And what I want to say about Taiwan, this is I've never lived there extensively. I've traveled there quite a bit, I would say. My dad's family is still there, but my mother left China because of political oppression. Communism was sort of on the rise there, and she moved to Taiwan. So she was born in China. My father was born and raised in Taiwan, and then they met in the States, actually. But here you have an island with its own indigenous people, by the way, who are not mainland Chinese. So even though if you were to speak to someone who's Taiwanese in the US, they're usually coming post 1965, when a Nationality and Immigration Act passed, they would be ethnically Chinese, even though they might claim Taiwanese as their identity. As a political marker, because they don't want to be affiliated with Communist China. But the island itself had indigenous people who were not ethnically Chinese. And there were some Hakka and Hoklo folks who came over, but the real migration of ethnically Chinese came as a result of political oppression. And before that, it was a Dutch colony, it was a Spanish colony, it was basically ruled by Japan for a while, and then China. And even now, Taiwan is not officially recognized by the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Every major airline in the US, I think for the most part, calls it China Taipei or China Taiwan in order to appease China, because the US's stance is a one China policy. So what that means is not to see this country as independent, but rather as a part of China, which is just not a political reality for the people who live in Taiwan. And so it's interesting for me to be a part, I think, someone who is born to immigrants from that country that is marginal still. In the Olympics, it's still called Chinese Taiwan or China Taipei or something like this. It's not even recognized as a sovereign country. To be born in kind of a bottom of the barrel place that's plagued by racism, and yet I think unfairly is caricatured as being the most racist state, when in fact racism is everywhere. And I think it's worse, ironically, when it's subtle. So what I'll credit Mississippi for in some ways is because it's overt, I think there's a little bit of hope there to kind of find ways to work through it. I mean, Jackson is majority Black now. I think the state is majority African American at this point. So I get really frustrated with the ways in which my home state is positioned as being, you know, sort of the par exemplar of national racism, when in fact, I mean, the place where I work, Princeton Seminary, is riddled with white hegemony from the beginning. I mean, our founding professors spoke against slavery, and they spoke just as passionately against abolition within my own, and they all had slaves within my own Methodist tradition. I mean, great American preachers like Whitefield helped to introduce slavery to Georgia. In Mississippi right now, we have the first Black bishop in the United Methodist Church, and I think he's had a hell of a time, not in small part because he's Black. You know, but all that being said, it's everywhere. So that was kind of a long and windy way. But I think what I'll finally close by saying is, for me personally, it's been this weird dance of trying to prove or live up to certain ideals of masculinity by both, either, you know, do I know karate, or is my business card prestigious enough, or have I accumulated enough wealth to kind of justify my space in American culture? And I think more largely for Asian Americans, it has been this kind of dance where negotiating anti-Asian American bigotry, which is on the rise with COVID-19 and the whole Kung flu or Chinese virus, this type of thing. The way that's been negotiated is just by the accumulation of wealth, you know, which I think is ultimately problematic and very anti-Christian, to think, okay, well, we'll just sort of take this. I mean, Asian American politics is now growing, and there's certainly much more of a counter politic. This is a designation that arose in 1968 from Uchiko. I'm forgetting his Uchioku, Japanese political theorist. But in any case, you know, why is it that the response to anti-Asian racism is prestige? Like, this seems to me very opposite of what grace is, and counter to what Christianity is about. And so, I think it's important for us to also think about the classist dimensions as we continue our conversation about race.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. I was taking down some notes. What I would say to the audience that's listening, we will all share things that are so profound that I would love for you to investigate these things that we're sharing about, the ways that we've experienced racism in our lands, as we're talking about the binary Black and white. Investigate these things. If this is the first time, and like for me, many of you have shared things that it's the first time I'm hearing about. So I would just investigate, do your research, do some studying, do some learning. If you're really serious about, doing this work of being an anti-racist, I think it would be great for you to continue your own work, your own learning of that. And we'll share a little bit more about that as we move forward. And Gerald mentioned a bit of this next question that we're going to just talk about is how have we, each of us, experienced racism here in America? And Gerald kicked us off with, just his experience in Mississippi. And I think every last one of us have mentioned a little bit of what it looks like to be from our countries and or from our context and experiencing racism. So just jump in the conversation. Let's have a conversation with each other. What has it been to wear the skin that you wear, to look the way that you look here in America? Anyone can jump in. We don't have to go in order. This is a conversation with friends.
I think I'll jump in to say that we don't always, at least for myself, I don't know that I always know what that looks like, right? Just thinking about, and like now I live here in Tennessee and I just do what I need to do, right? And sometimes that is having to do more than white males. And I think it's something that maybe I began to realize, but I don't know that I always knew. I feel like always having to go above and beyond, right? But before it was just, I think it was internalized as a way of you're just doing the best you can, or you're putting in 110 or whatever, all these things that we tell ourselves. But it's like, yeah, we're having to do this because we're competing. Like I just generalize it and say white men, right? And white supremacy. So I don't know that it's always so apparent. I think what I'll say too is what I appreciate about this conversation is that sometimes we don't talk about our own stories and our own histories. So like we don't have time to like sit there and reflect about where we've come from and to where we're at. And that I've had some of these conversations with Tasha. We're friends offline. We've worked together. And even just recently, I think last month, we saw each other and we were just talking. And I think about our conversation and it reminds me just that until I say some of these things out loud, I don't even realize how it has affected my habits, my behaviors, my reactions, right? And as we have these conversations, I think we can tie some of these things, a lot of these things, to white supremacy, where, and I'm not trying to say that we don't have a personal responsibility, but just living in that context. And I just don't think that we always have the time to reflect. So yeah, I'm just like really absorbing everything, and it just kind of keeps taking me back to certain times and certain incidents, and I know that I still haven't connected everything, but hopefully as I continue to have these conversations, again, like you mentioned at the beginning, right? How do I begin to deal with my own internalized racism? How am I being anti-racist every day? What am I doing to practice that? So maybe that was a lot of rambling, but I hope that you
No, it's good. No, it's good. I think Gerald, named it. There are overt ways and subtle ways that we experience it. And you shared that, there are sometimes it's happening, it's not very apparent. And I think that's the insidious nature of racism, that it's impacting you when you don't even, realize that it's impacting you. I think the other conversation that we can jump into, because for the sake of time, and as you led us into, Rosa, is the internalized racism. How because we've been in this, swimming in this sea of whiteness and sea of white supremacy, what that has done to us, how that has impacted us, and how that has turned our perspective in a way where we internalize the same racism that's happened to us, what that has looked like in our families, in our homes, with our children, with our siblings, in our culture, in our context, in the states that we're living in. What has it looked like for each of us in our context with the subject of internalized racism? Anyone can jump in.
Thank you, Dula. I think for first part of the question about how did you deal with racism, especially coming to the state at the age of 13. I've been called a camel jockey all my life, and I did not know what that meant, because I have never seen a camel in India. And so the first time to see a camel is in the Dallas Zoo as a school trip. So it didn't make sense. It didn't connect the dots of what it means to be a camel jockey. And then I was called a bunch of other names. When those names were called, I couldn't really understand at that time, but later on figured out how hateful it was, and being able to process those and understand those, and it just it makes you realize the person that's calling, the lack of knowledge of where India is, or not understanding who I am. And so the second part of the question, how do we deal with it? And I think first part is acknowledging our own viewpoints and that our own biases, and understanding those. And the first time, this was a couple of years ago, we were tackling racism, and just had a bunch of group of guys got together, and all we've done is just kind of having some authentic conversations of our own biases, and publicly acknowledging it for the first time. And that was a painful experience. It was very intense conversation of being able to say, these are things that I struggle with, and I have never voiced it to another race. And the group of guys were all different backgrounds, and being able to have an authentic moment to have that conversation, it was powerful. And then went on to say, what do we do about this? How do we, as leaders, how do we impact our community? And I think it's so important for us to be able to voice. When we are silent, we are making our decisions. And so being able to voice in a way that it is understanding, and being able to communicate in a way that communicates love, even in those moments of that. And I think the foundation is, at all costs, you have to know who you are, because I think nobody should call us who we are unless we identified it ourselves. And so being able to be rooted in knowing who we are, then we are able to stand up, and regardless of what is hurled, or perspectives and viewpoints and decisions made, then I think that's what I hang on to, is being able to identify and holding on to my identity.
Wow, that's awesome. There's so much I want to ask and I want to say. I'm like, oh my goodness, there are so many nuances, for me in my own native land, in where the way I see racism internalized, and how is, I think many of you have shared about, I think Niji, you shared about when parents are to marry their children, they're looking for the fairer skin, for the lighter skin. It's the same in Haiti, where the children, who are lighter are sometimes more favored, or more liked, or given the positive accolades. You're so pretty, you're so this, you're so that, you get the prettiest dress, and so on and so forth. And the darker ones, are given other names too, like in our family, one of my sisters would always be called Tinue, which means little Blackie, to call her that name by just the complexion. And it wasn't a positive, name. It wasn't a name that says, oh, little Blackie, come here, get the best fruits in the family, or get best resources in the family. It was not positive at all. And the children know the differences between the two. And I think when we came to America, the anti-Black racism that we heard from, across the ocean, because we watch TV, We saw what was happening in America, and we knew what side we wanted to be on in order to be successful. And that's the side of whiteness. And our parents would even encourage us, don't be, don't be a hoodlum. We knew what that meant. Don't bring one of those at home. We know what that meant. So this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. This is how we as people in the diaspora internalize our own racism, because sometimes we regurgitate that and we repeat it. And as you're saying, Stanley, about for us to recognize how we are internalizing our own racism is very important. And again, the audience, if you're watching, we're having a conversation with each other. This is not a conversation we have outside, because we don't want you watching to weaponize what we are saying against one another. This is a conversation between brothers and sisters that need to happen. We need to talk about these things. We need to expose it for what it is, so that we can heal and that we can be true and do the work of anti-racism. So I would love for the rest of you to chime in about this internalized racism as you've seen it in your context and within yourself even.
I would like to say before I get kicked off again. So we're having a major storm, and so power surges are happening. So the one thing that I think about a lot when I think in terms of internalized racism, for me personally, when I hear that term, I'm always thinking about the way I have turned racism against my own self, the way that I have allowed the stereotypes and the biases to inform how I see myself. But also the other thing that I find to be really interesting is the way that we kind of level this racism and this kind of one-upmanship of who's the most racist out of the marginalized groups, right? So it's like in the Latino culture or among Latinos, there's a lot of finger pointing to Dominicans, because apparently Dominicans got to be the most racist, of all the Latinos, or we can sit in a corner and talk about, Bollywood and Indian and how horrible they are to their darkest skinned brothers and sisters. And we just kind of, I don't want to call it a game because it's not funny and it's not a game, but it is this kind of one-upmanship of who's the most racist among us, and not a recognition that we are all perpetuating this damage to each other, right? And that these systems and placements exist in a way that we don't even recognize. I came to the United States at 10. I lived in Brooklyn. In Crown Heights, Brooklyn. There was a significant Haitian population in the area where I lived, a significant Caribbean population, West Indian, Haitian. There was just a lot. But there was a hierarchy, and it was like, the Haitians are the ones that everybody else picked on. We picked on the Haitian immigrants as like, the white people picked on us. The Barbadians picked on this ones, the Jamaicans picked on that ones, and then we picked on the Haitians, and we just kind of,
it's like the survival of the fittest.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So you always got to find somebody else to oppress. And who taught us that? The oppressors taught us that. That's where we learned that behavior, that you're okay as long as somebody else is below you. Yeah, I won't go on a rant about that.
No, thank you for sharing, and thank you for parsing out the terms as well, internalized racism, and what it means and how we do it I guess we can say intra racism within the groups of the diaspora, and all of that. Jose, jump in.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a whole lot, and I think important for me, is I've come to realize, at least as I see things, and people might disagree, I think there's this polarity in the way racism gets played out in this country. And one is, I really do think that at the base level of all expressions of racism in this country are anti-Blackness and white supremacy. I think that that's at the core. And I think that we sometimes try to avoid that, usually at the expense of our darker skinned sisters and brothers, at the expense of African Americans. So I think that's at the core. And at the same time, I don't think you can reduce the conversation to black and white. So I think the foundation is an anti-blackness and a white supremacy, but it is, that foundation is expressed in a weird combination of things that also kind of transcend that sort of foundation. And so I say that because I was reading a text by Paul Turner, who wrote a philosophical introduction to race. And in one of the chapters, he talks about this notion of invisibility. And he says that he detects kind of three ways in which invisibility, plays out in the US context. One, he says, the invisibility of the Black person. And what he means by that, and he's kind of following Ralph Ellison's great novel, Invisible Man, there's this, we never see Black people for who they are, that we actually see a caricature that the culture has built of Blackness and of Black people. And we never see Bob, Cliff, Susan, I'm just, we see whatever caricature we've plastered on what it means to be Black in this country. So we don't actually see the person. He also talks about this sort of that whites have an invisibility, particularly to their own whiteness. So they're invisible to the ways in which their own whiteness is constitutive of their own experience, of their own benefit. And so that's when you hear things, well, my family struggled too. And nobody's ever said, yeah, your family struggled, but you can get a cab in New York City. You can at peace talk to a police officer, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third invisibility is for those folks who aren't Black or white, who aren't particularly African American or any sort of white. And I think the reason why I say that is, I think when I experience internalized racism and the way I've experienced racism, I have to keep in mind this polarity. One, and I shared this last week in part one, I was racialized in this country in the sense that where racial category became primary. Now, again, it's not that there isn't racism in Puerto Rico. It's not that there isn't colorism in Puerto Rico. There is, but you're given two options, and then as a light-skinned Hispanic person, I'm never quite white, but there's a lot of benefits of whiteness that I have experienced in my own life. So that's the first thing in terms of there's an invisibility to my own unique makeup of who I am that I think it's important to name. The second one that I name is that because I'm light-skinned, I've benefited from kind of like, not quite honorary white, but I've been weaponized against other minorities and particularly against other Black persons. Whereas, when a white person didn't want to feel as racist, they go, well, look, Jose's a friend of ours, right? There's this sort of like latch on to Jose, who's light-skinned. I'm perceived to be less dangerous, though watch out for me. I can snap at any minute here. There's an anger that runs within me that eventually voices itself or acts out in scary ways, I'm sure. So I think this understanding that because Latinos, Latinas, we sort of we're brought into this Black-white foundation, and sometimes we're called to kind of pick and choose, and sometimes we're made invisible because we can't quite pick and choose. And then the third one is, I usually have a bigger beard, and but with COVID and wearing masks, I can't style that thing to save my life because the mask, I wear it and I firmly believe it, but it's cramping my style. So I've trimmed this down, but when I have the full beard going, post 9/11, I was on occasion mistaken for a Middle Eastern. And so then it brings up layers of not just bias against Middle Eastern, North African, Iranian persons from that part of the world, but also the sort of Islamophobia and this Christian privilege, which is the other side of that I both benefit from, that I have perpetuated in the past, and may the Lord forgive me. And I think I've made some good steps in sort of being a more responsibly interreligious person in the world. But I think that's some of the ways that I've tried to make sense of this really weird bipolarity, I think, that's here between the foundation is thoroughly anti-Blackness and white privilege,
Right.
and yet it manifests itself beyond that. And I
Yeah.
end with that just to say that I think as people who are not Black, that we must keep anti-Blackness at the core, that it's easy for us to become a Tommy Hilfiger ad with all these wonderful people from different races and say, hey, look how great we are, but we have to put anti-Blackness back at the table. I think we've deferred that conversation too far, and sometimes we're weaponized to defer that conversation. So I for one, want to keep that sort of anti-Blackness and white privilege before us.
Thank you for sharing that it's the both and, right? It's beyond the binary Black and white conversation, while at the same time there is a force, if you would say, and the force is anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And there's something about that. If we can lean into that core, the core of anti-Blackness and the core of white supremacy, it sounds like that's where we would do our greatest work to obliterate, racism, if we can lean into the core of anti-Blackness. Thank you for that. I will ponder these thoughts in the weeks to come. Gerald, any last words you want to add onto this conversation as we before we get into some questions here?
Sure, yeah. It's been so rich.
Yes.
And deep, and also confounding to think about. I think for me, I want to lift up just two, maybe three things. I completely agree with Jose that you've got this just kind of inextricable war really going on with white hegemony, white supremacy, driven by anti-Black racism. And then there's also this kind of national amnesia specific to the US, I think, regarding the depopulation of indigenous peoples. Francisco Bethencourt, in a book called Racisms, where he tries to trace a genealogy of how racism came to be, actually pins it on Columbus in a way, saying that Columbus came up with the word cannibal. And this was because when he went to the West Indies, he observed supposedly a practice of native peoples eating other people. We don't know how widespread this was or what the occasions were, but this is how we get the word Caribe or Canibe, where Caribbean comes from. And Canibe is sort of the base, the root word for cannibal. Well, it created this kind of letter writing. And it's important to keep in mind that Columbus was Spanish. He was Catholic. Off the ship, he was incredibly devout. He was basically wearing a habit like a monk. He read the daily office. He took the sacrament regularly. And he's producing this literature that gets translated in various European languages. And it ends up producing a kind of fictional trade about these people who are eating other people. And Bethencourt locates that as kind of a root of American racism, because it's easy for Columbus, when he's looking for human labor, to take these people as slaves and then to kill them if they're eating other people. When he brings back Arawak folks to Spain, it doesn't really work out. And from that, it evolves into an African slave trade. So I think it's also key to keep in mind that kind of subterranean level that we never really get at, and it's so difficult to talk about. But there's so many, over 400 broken treatises with Native peoples, and we barely, in passing, maybe at my home institution, Princeton, we mentioned the school sits on Lenape land or something, but this is really kind of a beginning of what becomes American racism. The other thing that I'll say for me personally is, how does this happen internally? I began my remarks by talking about trying to fit into masculine norms, and I think in a way I've been deeply shaped by white conceptions of beauty you know, in terms of what I found attractive, who my girlfriends have been. I developed some sort of white fetish, and this is directly a result of the kind of weight that I think white norms can have on someone. The other way that I think is a little more sophisticated is through education. Asian Americans are sort of a major critique is they're a kind of model minority. And what this really means is that we're good at assimilating to white norms. But I think it's striking, you know, that some of the biggest headlines regarding anti-Asian bias were admissions related to Harvard, or in New York, the testing that goes on to get into elite schools like Stuyvesant High School, of which I think there were only 10 Black students admitted last year or something like this. So it's a terrible problem. And Asian American families were enraged because they're like, well, why are we changing the testing standards? Or of course there's bias. And I kind of understand the frustration on their part. And at the same time, I think it's interesting that there's a lot of uproar about admission to elite schools, and there's not a lot of uproar about the fact that Truman was on a submarine singing hymns when Enola Gay dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, there's not a lot of uproar that the first ban regarding immigration was against the Chinese, and then that really the lifting of quotas had to do with a kind of shift in Asian American policy in 1965 that affects all of us here right now. I mean, modern immigration in the US is deeply tied to Asian American history, and yet none of this is really thought about or considered, or the fact that a majority of evangelical Christians, you know, these are the brand of Christians that voted Trump into office. Many of them are Asian American. Things like this, why aren't we also upset about this within Asian American culture? This shows how the kind of permeation I think that white norms have. If you were to visit a Chinese or Taiwanese American church and hear the songs that are sung, or sort of observe the style of worship, it basically looks white. You know, I would go so far as to say, with the exception of rituals like Tong Song Kido, which is a Korean type of fervent prayer where everyone is praying simultaneously, there's very little that can be distinguished as idiomatically Asian American Christian ritual or worship. So Christianity itself in this country is driven by white norms. And for all of us here on this conversation sponsored by Scarritt Bennett, I think we have to think about how part of the struggle, or the lament, as you were using the language last time, Jula, is a result of the faith that I hold near and dear, and I think that we have some sort of relationship. Christianity itself in this country is deeply racist. And in addition to anti-Blackness, it's had these weird permutations. You know, it was anti-Irish, it was anti-Jewish, it was anti-Mohammedan, as they say, you know, called Islam. And so it's a torrid history, even within white culture, sort of the French against the English, or the Spanish against the Italians, or and this makes for a convoluted picture when we think about how deeply embedded conceptions of race are, and in terms of who we are. And so what I want to say, coming back to education, is I think for Asian Americans, it's been seen as a way out. Well, if you excel in becoming educated and get a job where you can live a life of leisure and a decent income, then you can choose whether or not to be political. But this type of ambition is arguably also white, because all our major institutions were founded by white folks. And I'm a part of it now, you know, arguably teaching at one of a handful of elite theological seminaries in the world. And so, you know, what does that then mean? That the way in which I've tried to counter American racism is basically to become a company man. You know, to teach at a place called Princeton Seminary, to belong to the largest mainline Protestant denomination, United Methodism, which by last official count, 2014, was 93% white. How do you make a dent in any of that. I think I've tried by kind of doing the thing by just playing on the inside, but this is what's going on in my head as I think about internalized racism and how pervasive it is, and what it helps us to remember, to forget, to privilege, to think the way in which we frame solidarity and developing counterpublics and what that even means.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Gerald. This is such a good conversation and so rich. And we don't even have time to get into how do we feel about all this, you know? We're just scratching the surface of just about ideas. You know, these are our ideas, our experiences, and where we've been, what's been happening. Not even how that impacts us on a personal level. How when we live our lives in the day to day, how do we live out these layers, these ideas, these thoughts that we're pondering today? So I would say part 3 conversation, but I'm sure Scarritt Bennett has other things to do. But I thank you all. I value your thoughts, your experiences, and where you've been and where you are today, and for you to share. You know, and I sense this burden on each of you for this work, for trying to reimagine, you know, in some way, a new way to live, a different way to live, but we're in the midst of it. So, Gerald, did you have something to share? Oh, okay.
Thing on the other side of education, I think, and why this conversation is so important. I've constantly been pushed to learn about the majority cultural norms in the country. Mm-hmm. I've rarely had anyone, even who are close friends in my life, give much of a flip about where I come from and want to know that in detail. Certainly not like a doctoral student would studying their subject matter. And I think this is the kind of fallacy when we privilege ambition, like becoming educated and becoming a professional, because what we're doing, and I need to be careful because I'm in this business, but we're asking folks to become conditioned to fulfill a certain norm of citizenship, when on the flip side, there is zero interest in learning Tasha's story or Jose's story or Rose's, you know, yep. With deep sophistication. It's just like, oh, you're from Panama. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's what why this space is so important, why it's necessary for us to continue these types of dialogues, for us to lean into each other's lives and lift the layers. Tasha, I saw a finger.
Wanted to say real quick. Yeah, it was me. I just wanted to say real quick that I got kicked off, so I don't know if we addressed this, but I know earlier someone had asked in the comments, you know, how do you as an educator or parent encourage children to have an appreciation for diversity? And I think that what Gerald just shared is really important. Part of that is like you can't just have an intellectual or theoretical appreciation for other people's stories. Is you have to make the effort as the adult in the equation to actually invest in knowing the story that is not being told. And so it's not just, you know, get your child a doll that is from a different race or ethnicity. It's like all the stuff that's not being taught to them in school. Get a copy of the People's History of the United States and teach them what's not being taught. You know, you have to develop your own interest in the story and the arts and all that comes with it. So, you know, like Black people like to say they want our rhythms but not our blues. You got to invest in the rhythm and the blues. It's not just enough to exploit the art and the stuff that you like from a particular culture or race, and then ignore the pain that it took to get there. You know, here in the United States, the Black population in the United States will talk a lot about how the United States, the wealth, that this country was built on the bodies of Black people, people of color. That is the story worldwide. The wealth of the world was built on the blood and the bodies and the labor of oppressed people of color, the people who were not the majority, the oppressors. So not white, right? And so this is an important part of the story that is not being told. It's not the victors wrote the history books, and you can't just be like, well, we'll just introduce this little thing and we'll tell them that everybody is great and we appreciate everyone. You got to get the rhythm and the blues. You have to really invest in knowing the full story and not just the version that you are used to hearing. You got to get all of it. And that's how you get to gain an appreciation, because you could tell a child that, Black people are worthy and their value and their lives matter too. But if they never see or understand the contributions of Black people, if they never see Black people portrayed as anything but the thugs and the delinquents and the problematic people, if those are all the images that they get and there's no counter narrative and there's no truth to what they are getting, what you're saying is going in one ear. It might stay for a little bit, but eventually it's going to go.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for adding that piece to it. Reverend Charisma, I'm not sure if you're are ready to, I don't know where we are on time, and I want to respect time, because we can keep going. You know us, we can keep going. So I'll turn it over to you to either ask questions or concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you all so much for such a great, rich conversation. We are over time, so I'm going to ask you all to have your closing statements because we are unfortunately over time. There were 2 questions, and I think you already answered one of the questions about how do you educate your family. So thank you for that. The other one was, were these stories told to you by family members, or did all of you need to do research on your own to learn about the history of your countries of origin? So Niji, I'll lean to you. Would you answer that question?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's a mix of both. Parents, our family does give us some history. Our education system gives us some histories, and then our experiences also teaches us how we learn things. I can tell you, I would have never observed the posters, going back to the posters, going to India and seeing them and being able to notice that without having the experiences that I've had here. And so being able to have those, I think, is such a powerful way to, so I would answer it, it's all of the above is the best way that I would say it. And closing remarks for me is, about 5 years ago, I reevaluated my relationships and looking at what they are like from a racial, economic, all these different ways. And I think the more diversified our relationships are, the better we better we are equipped to learn from other people. And I think this panel is a great example of it, is being able to have our own experiences and bring it to the table. And when we do that, our children get to see that, and they get to see a viewpoint of a practical application of what these relationships look like. And I think that's a powerful message to have. And lastly, I would say we need to keep dreaming, just how Dr. King has dreamt about having a great nation where we can unite. And I think dream is what we are about, and continue to make small decisions so that we can change this world.
Thank you, Niji Stanley. We so appreciate you. Thank you for your love and passion for justice, and for joining us in this conversation, sharing your stories and guiding us in how we can be better co-conspirators in dismantling white supremacy. Again, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Rosa, I'll turn it over to you. Share your last closing statements. Thank you for being here these last 2 weeks. And what's your last closing statement for our audience?
Well, I think for them and for myself too is, I'm just thinking about last week, how we talked about the soup, and so I feel like I've enjoyed a great, broth and potatoes and all the greens. So absorbing your stories as that, and just really trying to enjoy all the flavors, and trying to remind myself of like the contradictions that we have to sit in and live in, and the contradictions, in our stories and sometimes in our behaviors. And not just to extend grace to others as I meet them and learn their stories, but also to myself, right? Like, it's okay to sit in these contradictions because we're very layered people. So I think that's kind of what I'm taking away for myself from these conversations. Thank you.
Rosa, thank you so much for being with us these last 2 weeks. Really enjoyed you sharing your stories and you modeling for us what it looks like to be a co-conspirator. Really appreciate your voice. Jose, my brother. Jose, we cousins. We got
That's
some
right.
cousin relationships.
That's right.
Here, right? But
That's
share
right.
with us your closing remarks as we end.
I think that I kept hearing my colleagues here, and let me tell each of you that y'all each have blessed me more than you'll ever know. So let me start by saying that. What I keep detecting in our conversations is, I think, a piece, when we talk about justice, we forget one more piece that must go with justice and must go with truth. And what I keep hearing is this need for courage. In Spanish, there's one word for courage. It's also the same word for anger, coraje. And I want to suggest that the way forward is to embrace this courage / anger. I think it was St. Augustine who said, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to ensure they don't stay that way. And I think what I keep hearing from these fierce leaders that I've had the humbling experience to panel with, and we'll make that a verb, even though it's not a verb, panel with, is this deep courage, that this deep coraje in both meanings that kind of drive our work. And I think if we could do anything to our children, for our children, it is instilling this coraje to live in this world differently, which takes work. But I want to say that my panelists here, fellow panelists, have instilled more coraje in me, and I'm grateful.
Jose Morales, thank you again for inviting us into the space of coraje. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your voice, your stories, and your passion for people. Thank you so much for being with us these last 2 weeks. Tasha, as we end this in this space, share with us your closing remarks.
I think I want to close with a story. So someone asked earlier about whether this was, from personal stories or study, and like Nisi said, is both. The Panama Canal is estimated some 50,000 laborers built it. They had to clear jungle. They died from disease and animals and snake bites. And then when they were done with the jungle, to build the Culebra Cut, they had to literally throw dynamite sticks in a hole and run away from the dynamite in time before it blew up. And so of the 50,000 people who are mostly, about 3/4 of them were Afro-descendants, it's estimated that in excess of 25,000 laborers died in building the Panama Canal. There's an untold number of men who were maimed by the act of using the dynamite. My father's grandfather, my great-grandfather, lost a leg working the Culebra Cut. So it's deeply personal as well as, academic. So there were stories and understandings that I had. And of course, I had to go back and kind of get the numbers and the facts and the dates right. So it's very personal. I think that from this conversation, the thing that is really striking is that the anti-Blackness and the white supremacy, as Jose pointed out, that's at the core of it, it's foundational. It's foundational to these countries that we live in and the countries that we came from. It's foundational to the institutions that we deal with, to the way the entire empire was built. And so it's really important that we all understand that people who say that they're committed to this understand that kumbaya moments are not going to fix this. It's at the root of everything. And in order to undo it, you're going to have to dismantle some things, because the thing is, it's like it's rotten at the core. It's festering from the core, and you can't just whitewash it. You can't paint it over. You're going to have to tear down some things and rebuild it. And that's a really critical thing to understand. It is the same everywhere. This thing is a disease that has festered and spread all over the world. And it's not a simple fix. It's not going to happen with statements from companies and anti-racist seminars once in the next 2 years. We're going to have to do the work of really looking at stuff and dismantling it.
Tasha, thank you so much for joining us these last 2 weeks. I'm grateful for your wealth of knowledge around this work of racial justice, your love for this work, your commitment to this work. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you and your stories. Gerald, I so appreciate you being with us. What are your last words as we depart from this space?
Thank you so much again for inviting me to be a part of it, Shirizan, and for Jula and Tasha and Jose and Rosa and Niji. This has been incredibly illuminating, I think. What I would say picks up on what's already been shared across my co-panelists, and that is that I think part of developing an effective approach to the effective multi-dimensional, multifaceted, intercultural, multicultural approach to anti-racism is doing what seems mundane, not just getting caught up in what's amazing. So, okay, state flag changes, or the Redskins change their name, or Breonna Taylor helps to free a prisoner. And these are amazing stories, but also to see that just in the folks we know, there are amazing stories. And all we have to do is go past this surface. I think I also want to give one anecdote as an example. 113 Pebblebrook Drive, which is the address of the house I grew up in, was probably the first house in Clinton, Mississippi, built by an Asian American, my dad. But does the city care about that? Probably not. But I think just learning what seems trivial and loving others as ourselves, as Jesus has commanded. First, being able to love ourselves and all our contradictions and complications, but then taking an interest in other people's stories that just seem mundane, boring. The last great social reformer, MLK, in the US was a Black Baptist preacher, and it's kind of a cliched line about little Black boys and girls playing with little white boys and girls. But what I want to lift up is the idea of play. Part of what's been so effective at mainstreaming Black Lives Matter is the fact I think that people have had more free time on their hands as a result of the pandemic. And I wonder what it would be like if we could get together, not only for a common fight, but just to be able to enjoy one another's company. And part of being able to do that, I think, is finding how mundane stuff, ordinary stuff about each other, and cherishing it. And so that's my last bit of advice, that would be the kind of educational approach we take, just to get to know ordinary stuff about the people around us, and especially the people we think we don't want to have anything to do with.
Wow. Thank you, Gerald. I so appreciate you. Thank you for inviting us to a space of truth telling. I mean, you laid a whole lot of truth telling in this space these last 2 weeks. And so I want to say thank you so much for that, for teaching us how to be vulnerable and tell the truth, even when the truth hurts, right? Thank you, Gerald, so much for being with us. Really appreciate you. And last, certainly not least, Gerald Prevalon, who led the way these last 2 weeks, guiding us, moderating this conversation. Gerald, thank you so much for an excellent, well done. And so I turn it over to you for your last words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I've just made friends, and I'm grateful for all of you guys for teaching me, for listening, for being truth tellers and truth hearers as well. For my last words, you know, sometimes I find myself at a place of deep lament and hopeless because I feel lost because I can't see the way forward, right? I can't see how we can reclaim what's been lost. You know, I can't see how do we undo what's been done? And it seems so daunting, and it seems like there will never be any light. But today and the past 2 weeks, what we have done has given me hope. Hope in a sense that there are some ways to move forward. And some of the ways have to do with truth telling and truth hearing, have to do with these types of communities, have to deal with courage and anger, righteous anger, has to do with just doing mundane things, have to deal with dismantling, you know, white supremacy. And so I value each of you for giving me hope in this season, in this time, for hearing these stories, for and I sense that each of us here will not just let these just be about stories, but also impact the system as well, you know, because we know better. This isn't just about stories, but in each of our own ways, we're impacting the system of dismantling white supremacy. So thank you all for giving me hope. Thank you for normalizing lament as well, because I think it's both and. Having hope and at the same time lamenting, at the same time telling the truth, at the same time having the courage, at the same time fearing, at the same time, you know, all of the above, you know, and finding space to doing that. So thank you all for teaching me. You are great teachers.
Dilla Prevalon, we thank you for your Black girl magic, what you did for us these last 2 weeks. You moved us from guest panelists to friends and colleagues to actually being family. Thank you for modeling what it looks like and what it means to be family in spite of difference. Thank you so much, Jola. Thank you again all for being here. To our audience, we're grateful for you and sticking with us. Most of you are still here, for sticking with us, even though we went over time, but I thought it was worthy to hear the closing statements of our panelists. So thank you so much for joining us every week. We have some repeat offenders, folks who come every single week. We're so grateful for you for sticking with us in this work. We're really passionate about this work and very intentional about what we do and how we bring you these conversations every week, because again, we approach this work with the conviction that transformation is possible. And that's what we really need. We need folks who are being transformed by the renewing of their minds and their hearts. And we believe one of the ways to do that is through storytelling. Join us next week as we partner with Meharry Medical College so that we can have a conversation about COVID-19 and back to school. Many of our kids are prepping to go back to school. Many families are prepping to go back to school. Well, what does that mean while we're still in the midst of a pandemic, having to change our way of life, wearing masks and washing our hands? We should be already doing that. But we have the one and only Dr. James Hildreth, president of Meharry College scientist who's been leading the way, not just in the city, but in this country about getting a vaccine. He'll be here to talk to us about the updates of the virus and also the vaccine. And he'll have his medical team with us to give us, to tell us ways that we can continue to protect ourselves and our children in this season of going back to school. So please join us next week for this great conversation, the special back to school special with COVID-19. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. Panelists, we can't say thank you. Thank you is not enough, but but we're going to start with thank you for all that you have offered us these last 2 weeks through your stories and wisdom and knowledge and passion. God bless you all and see you all next week. Bye-bye.